Καλησπέρα. Καλησπέρα σε όλες και όλους. Καλώς ήρθατε στην εκδήλωση του Τμήματος Πολιτικής Επιστήμης και στο Εργαστηρίου Γεωπολιτικών Αναλύσεων. Θα συνεχίσω φυσικά στα αγγλικά. May I welcome Professor Mahoney and Dr. Manenti, and thank Professor Mahoney for his kindness to address both Department of Political Science and the Laboratory of Geopolitical Analysis. May I also thank my old friend, Professor Katrougalos, for bringing us, organizing and bringing this contact, and Dr. Manenti for helping me in organize. Once again, to both our guests, welcome. Professor Mahoney is the Director of International Studies at East Normal University in Shanghai, if my reading is correct, apologies otherwise, and he holds a PhD from George Washington University in the United States. Vasilis will address a little more about the subject, but I think we are all living in a volatile, changing world with emerging economies, if we call China an emerging economy, because China is a very old country, for that matter, with new or perhaps not that new figures, political. This is a reference to President-elect Trump, political figures, but also ideologies and interests behind the election of these figures. We usually talk about Trump and we don't think about ideologies, etc. Also, we are in a world with at least 2 ongoing wars. I'm saying at least because there are about, I think, 18 armed conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. That means that we are in a geopolitical, volatile and interesting world, alongside China's economic growth and development. Are we living in a new geopolitical world? Or may I use welcoming our guests once more and asking for Vasilis to make some more introduction, but as a matter of welcome, may I use the old Chinese saying, may you live in interesting times. Welcome, thank you.
I have to read your... Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας. Εκ μέρους ως Διευθυντής του Εργαστηρίου Γεωπολιτικών Αναλύσεων θέλω να σας ευχαριστήσω ιδιαίτερα για την παρουσία σας εδώ. Να ευχαριστήσω καταρχήν τον συνάδελφο Λεωνίδα Μακρύ που μας παραχώρησε την αίθουσα γιατί κανονικά θα είχε μάθημα. Να ευχαριστήσω όλους εσάς που θεωρώ ότι θα βγείτε κερδισμένοι πολλαπλά από την αίθουσα αυτή όταν ολοκληρώσουμε την σημερινή εκδήλωση. Είναι η πρώτη εκδήλωση που κάνει το Εργαστήριο Γεωπολιτικών Αναλύσεων για αυτή τη σεζόν. Ευελπιστούμε ότι θα ακολουθήσουν και αρκετές άλλες. Αυτή τη στιγμή, λοιπόν, έχω την τιμή και τη χαρά να φιλοξενούμε τον καθηγητή Mahoney από το Πανεπιστήμιο της Σαγκάης. Ήδη ο κύριος Δικαίος ανέφερε ορισμένα πράγματα. Θα αναφέρω ορισμένα πράγματα στα ελληνικά από το βιογραφικό του και μετά θα κάνω μια μικρή εισαγωγή και εγώ στα αγγλικά. Ο καθηγητής Mahoney, λοιπόν, είναι καθηγητής πολιτικής επιστήμης και διεθνών σχέσεων στο East China Normal University. Είναι εκτελεστικός διευθυντής του Διεθνούς Κέντρου Εξελιγμένων Πολιτικών Σπουδών. Είναι ο ιδρυτής και διευθυντής του Διεθνούς Μεταπτυχιακού Προγράμματος στην Πολιτική Επιστήμη του εν λόγω Πανεπιστημίου και είναι επίσημος σύμβουλος της κινεζικής κυβέρνησης για πολλά ζητήματα τα οποία έχουν σχέση με το αντικείμενό του. Το να είναι λοιπόν ένας δυτικός και μάλιστα Αμερικανός τόσο κοντά στην κινεζική κυβέρνηση και να του συμβουλεύει, θεωρώ σημαίνει κάτι για την αξία του ως επιστήμονα, αλλά και την δυνατότητα που έχει να μας μεταφέρει ορισμένα στοιχεία για την Κίνα. I'll switch to English now. Professor Mahoney, it's a deep honor, profound honor to have you with us. Professor Mahoney will deliver a speech, a lecture, on the geopolitical position of China in the global sphere. And of course, after his introduction, for which you can have as much time as you want, there will be a Q&A session, a question and answer session. I would like to emphasize that since this event is held in English, anyone who wishes to ask a question, please do so in English. Professor Mahoney, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you both for the kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know that you might have better things to do. It's a little cold outside, but it's certainly a pleasure. I've never been this far north in Greece. I do have quite a bit of fondness for your country, so it's good for me to come up here and see what you have going on here. What I'd like to do is ask you to indulge me for a few minutes. For most of my career, I have taught Chinese politics, Chinese history, but also because I'm a professor in China, I get asked to teach Western philosophy, Western political philosophy. So for the past 20 years, I've also been teaching Greek philosophy. And I ask you to indulge me because I would like to teach a little bit of Greek philosophy in a Greek university, even though I'm sure you could all teach me much more than I know. In this context, the purpose is to take just a few minutes to try to explain the fundamental difference between Chinese and Western thought, and how these two differences relate to a different conception of a global political order. Okay? Now, you are all familiar with, how do you say his name in Greek? Aristotle. Aristotle. And Aristotle is probably the most important philosopher of modernity, in so much as he gave us the three laws of logic, right? And these show up again and again. They get reintroduced into Western thought in 1265 with the Summa Theologica of in English we call him Thomas Aquinas, and
Tommaso d'Aquino.
Yeah, there we go. So as you recall, the three laws of logic: number one, the law of identity; number two, the law of non-contradiction; number three, the law of excluded middle, right? Now, scholars teach us that the most important of these laws is number two, that if you have the law of non-contradiction, you can derive the first and the third law from the second. Now, it's important to know that Aristotle was not the first to articulate a law of non-contradiction. We can see a similar way of thinking in the Hindu Vedas, long, long before. Now, is it likely that there was some sort of transmission from these ancient ways of thinking to Aristotle? We can't find any indication that there was. Maybe at some point we will find something that proves otherwise. So it's important to think, is there possibly a connection between the old thinking in India versus the thinking of Aristotle? And the one thing that scholars, including myself, I've written extensively about it, is the extent to which when Aristotle is thinking, he's thinking in Greek. And Greek has a relationship with Sanskrit, the old language of India, right? In other words, these two languages belong to the Indo-European family of languages, and it's theoretically the case, or theoretically possible, that when Aristotle was thinking in Greek, the three laws of logic were already prefigured in Greek language, grammar, vocabulary, and so on, right? And of course, we know most languages in Europe, most languages in the West belong to this same family. So let me now turn to this whiteboard where I'm going to draw something, and I hope you are able to see it. In the middle period of the Shang dynasty, and the Shang dynasty by some accounts is the first dynasty, by other accounts is the second dynasty, but it's the first dynasty where the Chinese begin to develop formal writing, or a formal writing system. And if we go back to the earliest writing, we can find a character that looks like this. Now this is really two characters pushed together as one, okay? Oh, excuse me. There we go. Okay, so we could argue that this is the oldest and most important philosophical concept in Chinese language and thought. This part of the character we call Yue, and this part we call He, but all together we call it He. In this case, this part of the character serves as the phoneme, all right, which indicates, according to the old logic, that it was the more important part of the character. Now this is actually a pictograph of, I don't know what you call it in Greek. In English, we call it millet. Millet. In Chinese, we call it xiaomi. What do you call it in Greek? It looks like, in the West, we would call it, in America, we would call it bird seed, the little yellow seed. Do you know what I'm talking about? In China today, we still make a porridge from it, or sometimes we mix it with rice and little golden balls in the rice. But the millet was the staple food of the Shang dynasty. They didn't grow rice. They didn't have enough water in that part of China. And so this was a picture of the millet plant. It had a heavy head of seed. And so this is the picture of millet, or food. And this here, this is a musical instrument. It's if you look carefully, you can see 3 bamboo flutes, okay, brought together under a single mouthpiece, right? And each flute is cut to a different pitch, so when you blow, you can get a harmonious sound, right? Now in China, the concept of harmony is always that you have to combine differences. For example, you can't make a good soup from water alone. You have to combine the salty, the savory, the spicy, the sweet. Combine all of these differences in a unique way in order to get something that's tasty or beautiful. Now, the logic here is that if, and let me explain what this word means. This word means harmony, but it also means and, the conjunction. So if you want to have harmony in an agricultural society, the first thing you have to have is food, right? But in order to produce a surplus of food in an agricultural harmony, you have, in an agricultural society, you have to have social harmony, okay? So these two things have a relationship with each other. We might even say a dialectical relationship. Now, according to Confucius, there was an old story. One of his students said, Master, if you only have time to study one of the classics, because you know there are many Confucian classic works, if you only have time to study one, which one should you study? And Confucius says the book of songs, or what we sometimes call the book of poetry, because at least there you can learn the principle of harmony, and this is the most important thing to know. Now, in contemporary Chinese, just to finish the point, in contemporary Chinese, this character gets simplified as this, okay? Now, again, this word has two meanings, harmony and the conjunction and, okay? If you see this symbol, and I know that it's getting messy here, but you know the symbol of the yin-yang of the Tao, right? A lot of times when Westerners look at this, they see a binary, they see a dualism, they see a black and a white. But the purpose of this symbol is to show you the exact opposite of that. In other words, you should imagine that you're looking at a cup of coffee, or if you've ever had a cup of Vietnamese coffee and it has that thick condensed milk, sweetened condensed milk on the bottom, and you pull it up and you can see it and then you start to stir it. This is, you know, Lao Tzu or whoever came up with the symbol, they're not drinking coffee, but you can see that it's stirring, okay? So it's reminding you that sometimes you see the world in terms of black and white, male and female, good or evil, but you need to understand that reality is actually ever-shifting shades of gray, right? So this is the most important philosophical concept, and it leads to a principle that we call the unity of opposites. The unity of opposites. Now, if you had to say, what's the ontological statement or first principle of Western thought, maybe we could argue that it's the law of non-contradiction. But in the Chinese sense, it is the unity of opposites. And sometimes it's written in contemporary Chinese as the law of contradiction, right? So these two very different ways of thinking. And why is it that these two different civilizations came up with almost opposite ways of viewing the world? We don't know. They're theories, and it's not the purpose today to talk about that. The key point is, if you want to understand Chinese thought, it's that it emphasizes and, whereas in Western thought, we tend to emphasize or, okay? Now this is very important because it has tremendous impact not only in traditional Chinese thought, but also how China understands and develops Marxism. And indeed, it's this point where Chinese Marxism is fundamentally different from Russian or Soviet Marxism. In Russian Marxism, in Lenin and others, when he talks about the unity of opposites, and he uses this term, he's very explicit. He means mutually exclusive opposites, right? But when Mao Zedong is talking about the unity of opposites in 1937, where he's explaining the idea, he writes an essay called On Contradiction and another one called On Practice. He's indicating that it's not about mutually exclusive opposites, but how opposites coexist and change each other through change, or through the movement of time and different experiences. Now, if you understand these two essays by Mao and you understand modern Chinese history since then, you can see how this logic plays out. In Mao's three-world theory, which is very important to the Chinese view of the world, which was introduced to the world by Deng Xiaoping on Mao's behalf at the UN in 1974, you can see this logic at work. When you see China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution embracing the United States, you can see this logic at work. when you see Deng Xiaoping talking about the socialist market economy or one country, two systems, you can see this logic at work, right? When the third generation of leadership by Jiang Zemin is talking about the three represents, or the Sangha Daibiao, and he's talking about the importance of including capitalists in the party, this is this logic at work. You can see it again with Hu Jintao when he talks about the harmonious society or the scientific development concept and the need to balance. You can see it again. And now you can see it also with Xi Jinping in terms of his various concepts related to how the world has different civilizations, but they have to learn to live together to create a shared future for humanity. Now, this is political theory, and one has every right to question whether or not it's just propaganda or nonsense, right? But I'm telling you, this is the fundamental philosophy that's expressed and explained, and we'll see whether or not over time it bears out. Okay, so enough of the whiteboard. Let's move to, and enough of this theory, let's move to some difficult pictures. So on the slide cover, we have the picture of the Chinese Navy, and they are engaged here in a major exercise in the South China Sea. But let's all be honest with ourselves, and certainly later when we get to the Q&A, if I don't talk too much and you don't all get up and leave, ready to do something else with your life. And by the way, let me just let you know, I completely love difficult questions. Whatever difficult or nasty question, or it can be kind. I wouldn't be disappointed if it's a kind question, but I really like difficult questions. Please feel free to hit me with whatever you have. But there is this fear of China. We can call it xenophobia. Thank you, sir. So nice to meet you. There is this fear of China. It's a fear that has been promoted, I think, substantially by the White House. I think it's a fear that is not a new fear. We can go back to when the Jesuits were first going to China several hundred years ago, when they were encountering a civilization that was so advanced that they classified the Chinese people as being white, right? Because if the Chinese people were not white, that might mean that they were a different race and therefore racially superior to Europeans. So they classified them as white. And then later, when Europe rose, they classified them as a subordinate race. But it's precisely this term that we get from Kaiser Wilhelm back in was it late 1800s, early 1900s, this term, the yellow peril, right? And then you had the US promoting Chinese exclusion laws. You had all of this fear-mongering about China. But above all, you had these narratives that China is down, she's vulnerable, and kick her while she is, because when she stands up again, she will be a danger to us, right? So contemporary China anti-discourses have returned to the xenophobic tropes, but the real yellow peril is what? Anybody know? You ought to know here in Greece. Do you see the yellow peril? What is it? Sand. Where does the sand start? Africa. Where does it move? Across Africa, across the Middle East, across Central Asia, and now the dust storms, the sandstorms are blowing into Beijing. China is being hollowed out. Is it caused by climate change? That seems to be the consensus opinion among scientists. Is it just some other change that's happening? That's not our purpose tonight to talk about the politics of climate change, although I'm firmly in the position of believing that climate change is a real problem and that we have something to do with it. Nevertheless, China is the country in the world that is most vulnerable to climate change. They are being hit in two directions. On the one hand, the desert coming in, and on the other hand, the rising water and extreme weather from the ocean side, from the coastal regions. China is home to 3 of the 5 most vulnerable areas of the world. The first is Shandong, which is just south of Beijing. The second is where I live, the Shanghai, Jiangsu area. And the third is Guangdong, down south where Hong Kong and Guangzhou and those places are, which we refer to as the Greater Bay Area. Now, when I say most vulnerable, obviously there are some places in the world that will probably cease to exist, like the Maldives, right? But in terms of total number of people exposed and fixed capital investment, China is by far number 1. So in this context, we should understand that when China is talking about building an ecological civilization or the need to foster global cooperation on climate change, or indeed when China has in fact taken the global lead in developing a green economy and green innovation and development, they are very serious about it, right? Now, have they been serious? How long have they been serious about it? In fact, they have been talking about it and building things in a piecemeal sort of way for not an insignificant amount of time. We might even say 10 years before the current leader came to office. However, and this was about 12 years ago that he came to office. However, after he came to office, and keep in mind, when President Xi came to office, his number 1 priority was a party rectification campaign in order to deal with corruption and ineffective governance, which had in fact gridlocked China and prevented necessary economic reforms that were needed as China was going to transition away from export-led growth to a more moderate growth economy. I won't get into the reasons for the factionalism and why that had gridlocked, but simply to say that that was the charge given to him. This is why he was empowered by the party to effectively cut the wrists of the party. In other words, most of the people who are falling because of corruption are party members themselves, right? This was his first objective, but when he took power, the number 1 thing that people demanded was that he deal with air pollution and water quality issues, right? And this was a source of frustration because he had his marching orders, but the public demanded that he deal with the terrible air pollution that we had in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, many other tier 1 and tier 2 cities. So what did they do? The first thing they did is they made it a requirement for promotion. If you're a party leader or a city official, you cannot get promoted if you don't achieve a certain number of good quality air days, if you don't significantly improve your local water resources over a period of time, and they attached a lifetime accountability to this. So if it's discovered at some point 4 or 5 years down the road that there was pollution on your watch, you will be held responsible. You will lose your job and possibly face prosecution if it was due to some intentional neglect or corrupt reason. This is why, over the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen a remarkable turnaround in the air quality, in the greening of cities, but also water quality. I'll give a few examples of that later, but I'm just saying this was something that was really on the minds of people, and this is what they forced the government to deal with. He also dealt with the corruption issue and a few other things, but this was something that really moved forward. The other thing that he did was he consolidated the what had already been underway which was China saw not only the strategic necessity, given their concerns related to climate change, but the strategic opportunity to become a global leader in green development. Why? Because as an American, as far back as I can remember, from the 1970s, certainly, I didn't exist before the 1970s, but in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the US coal, automotive, and oil industries worked together to suppress the development of green technologies. Now we know that finally Tesla breaks through and creates a product, but it's a very expensive product. It's not very reliable. But nevertheless, there was some movement, but China went all in on this because they saw it as a strategic opportunity because others had failed to really move as quickly as they should, or perhaps they didn't have the opportunity to leverage China's advantages in terms of manufacturing. But nevertheless, this is the first thing that we need to consider when we're talking about China's worldview. Now, this part here with the little white, the little mountaintops, I'm sure you recognize those are the Himalaya, and the part just north of the Himalaya would be Tibet, right? And this is going to bring us to our first strategic discussion because there's a lot of concern about Tibet and China's relationship with Tibet. So why is Tibet valuable to China? Why does China care so much about Tibet? Why is it non-negotiable? The answer is very simple. Tibet is the highland. Okay, it's the highland. Now, if you know a bit about history, you know that for a very long time, the United Kingdom and Russia played the 100-year game over who could get control of Tibet, right? And the old paradigm is that there were two places you needed to control in Asia in order to control Asia. One was Afghanistan, which remains a source of contention to this day, and the other was Tibet. Why? Because whoever controls Tibet controls China, okay? This is why even before the communists win the Civil War, you have the Kuomintang, the nationalists. They fought the Sino-Tibetan War. And even before then, in the old dynastic period, they also recognized the strategic importance of Tibet. Now, why? What is it precisely that is so important about Tibet? Well, the first is an easy answer. You know, for example, that Israel, some years ago, seized the Golan Heights, right? So whoever occupies the high ground can easily lob missiles or other things of low technology onto you, and that's always going to be a concern. But the even bigger issue is that most of China's rivers, their headwaters are in Tibet. And whoever controls the headwaters of those rivers controls China's agriculture. And that agriculture is water intensive. And where it is most intensive is just under the Tibetan plateau in Sichuan, Hunan, and Yunnan, right? So this is why in the past, when you had, let's say, what the Chinese refer to as the century of humiliation, following the Opium Wars in the 1840s, when the foreign powers, quote, were carving China up like a melon, China was never fully colonized. It was always a semi-colonial country because the foreign powers were never able to gain control over Tibet. They could only exert a certain amount of control over the coastal regions and just a little bit inland, right? So Tibet has always been the key. And if there's no Chinese control of Tibet, there's no China, right? This is the fundamental realist lesson to be learned here. And again, here you can see the river systems. They all start in Tibet. Now, one of the things that we know is that climate change and water scarcity is almost always at the source of conflicts. Last year I was in Ukraine doing field work, trying to understand that conflict, And I don't think water was the main source there. I think it was two fossil fuel dependent economies, the United States and Russia, fighting a proxy war over control of energy markets and how we pay for energy. And Ukraine was the battlefield for that. But many of our other conflicts, you scratch deep enough and you find that water or control of water resources are somehow underneath it all. Now, this is a picture of Zhu Kojin. He was born in 1890, died in 1974. And he was one of the first pioneers in the study of how climate change affects not only civilizations, but governments. And he was the person who first noticed that the mini ice age was likely a contributing factor to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. And so he's held in high reverence in China today. Of course, there were other factors, but nevertheless, we know that climate change, and the Chinese themselves are very much aware that climate change can make you or break you. We also know that we are living in an era that scholars describe as the Anthropocene, and that the Anthropocene has a period called the Great Acceleration, sometime in the early 1900s, really taking off in the 1950s, that have brought us to where we are today in terms of the crises that we face. Now, this is showing us water withdrawal as a percentage of total available water, 1995 versus 2025, and you can see where the situation or access to water has gotten significantly worse over that period of time and is projected to get worse still. And this is just another map showing basically the same thing, so we can skip over it. Sorry for the double slide. Now here, we can look at China, where we can see groundwater depletion. And again, we can see by looking at water resources precisely that yellow area that we saw, the desertification moving across China. And then here, the dark circles are cities that are now without water, okay? As we're starting to lose whole areas. Now, some of them will remain, some of them are oases, and there are some efforts to build a great green wall to stop the desert and to try to return things, but nevertheless, this is a key feature. Anytime I go to the Chinese Northwest, it's immediately apparent. Now, this is what has occasioned these crises and this understanding of the crisis. This isn't something that people are thinking about in a theoretical or abstract way. They don't have water, they are eating dust, and so they understand that whatever the cause, there is a problem. And so this is why we see these tremendous efforts to start changing the ecological picture under the rubric of building an ecological civilization. Now, I live here. This is in Shanghai, and this is a picture of Suzhou Creek. It's a large creek that runs throughout Shanghai. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was basically a canal along which there were many factories. It was filled with barges and pollution. When I first moved to Shanghai for the job that I currently have in 2010, it was still pretty much an open sewer. I could tell you a disgusting story, but it would kill too much time and it would unfortunately be disgusting, where I was running out of time and I took my son fishing in that river, and what we caught twice. But what we have seen in the last 6 or 7 years, it's a project that began before that, it's called the Suzhou Creek Rehabilitation Project, is that the river has been completely cleaned up. They built green spaces running along the side of the river throughout the city, and it's dozens and dozens of kilometers long. My children's bedroom window, it looks out onto the creek, and now we have river birds. People are fishing, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it myself. I don't fault you at all if you don't believe it, right? I wouldn't believe it, but I see it every day now. And I think, literally, when I was here before, it was a sewer, and now it is something that has returned to ecological health, despite the fact that there are 25 million people living on top of it, right? Why? Because local leaders were made responsible. If you want to get promoted, clean it up. If you want to go to jail, don't, right? It was really, I mean, it wasn't an and situation, it was an or situation, right? Now this is just in my local city. This is in Hunan. Now one of the interesting things about Chinese agriculture is somewhere between 20 to 30% of its food security comes from terraces. And these terraces are primarily located in Hunan, Sichuan, and Yunnan. Now, I can't remember the actual proportion of arable land that is terraces, but the terraces are producing per hectare a lot more than other parts of China. Now, one of the things that we know about the terraces is that they are extremely resistant to climate change. We also know that they are probably 2,000 to 3,000 years old. All right? In other words, they've been here for a long time. They have stood the test of time. Now, it's of course the case that these areas may be more protected geographically from climate change, and that's certainly important. But Chinese scientists have now been sent to these terraces to try to study them. In other words, what can we learn about them? What is the ancient wisdom that's contained in these spaces? How can we protect them? How can we ensure that they remain organic? How can we bring technology to them without corrupting them? How can we relieve the farmers who no longer want to work these areas because it's so labor intensive? What sort of technology can we bring in to ensure that we, again, promote higher yields without compromising the overall ecological value of the space? So this is, and this is a picture of a terrace in Hunan province. The other thing, of course, is that China is now the world leader in renewable energy production. We do have a problem that we're not yet as good as we should be in terms of using all of the green energy that we produce. But if you follow the news, there was not this year, but last year we had some rolling blackouts in some cities because local officials were rushing to implement green energy strategies, and they didn't make coal purchases. You know, you don't just buy coal and it shows up tomorrow. You got to buy it long in advance, and then they got to ship it, and you got to stockpile it. And last year we had this tremendous economic boom as the world economy was coming back online. People were buying things, and Chinese factories were humming. And we had a record hot summer, so people were using the AC, the air conditioner, a lot more. And then the other problem is we didn't have enough rain, and so some of the hydro power plants were not being able to produce enough energy, or not at the expected capacity. So they were being too aggressive in their greening, and they needed to make some adjustments and move back. But nevertheless, this is an entrenched trend. Now this is a picture, again, not far from where I live. This is Chongming Island. Chongming Island is an island just off the coast there from Shanghai and Jiangsu. It's an important barrier island. We are facing some tremendous risk there with salt water starting to come into the island. There are tremendous efforts now to rebuild the saltwater marshes. But again, these are things that are being undertaken not on the principle or ideal of conserving nature, but as a matter of national security in the face of climate change. I thought I had another slide here. Yeah. Now this is a city in Anhui called Hefei. It's the capital city of Anhui. And I was there. This is the mayor right here. And this is the project leader. And Hefei is a very interesting city. Anhui is a very interesting province. It was historically one of the more backward provinces. It was the one that suffered the most during the Great Leap. It's where we saw the most number of deaths. And so it's struggled, I think, to recover historically from this. But what we have in Hefei, firstly, is we have a mayor who has a PhD in environmental science. And right next to the city of Hefei, there's this massive lake called Chaohu Lake, much bigger than the city. And they put the entire lake under the jurisdiction of the mayor. Now, the lake, heavily polluted with industrial waste, heavy metals, so forth and so on. So there's this massive dredging project where they're dredging up all the heavy metals. They're processing them, pressing them into like big bricks or cinder blocks, and then they're transporting them into the mountains where the depleted coal mines are and storing them in the coal mines, right? At the same time, they're restoring a ring of wetlands around the city to serve as carbon traps, right? And they go all the way around the city. So the lake is part of it, but then these wetlands go around. And what they're doing, this is a long-term vision of building a protected green oasis. At the same time, they're doing massive investment in technology industries in the city, all right? Green energy, EVs, so forth and so on. So this is another example of sort of a massive project that's being driven by global ecological concerns and trying to find solutions. It's also the home of a tokamak fusion reactor, and China is at the cutting edge of those efforts presently. It's also home to the new EV plant, and I toured that facility. The entire factory line for their most advanced model, 3 workers, right? Everything else, robotics, right? And this is why I think it was in the Wall Street Journal recently, the Ford CEO came to China and they did a tear down of some of China's leading EVs, and he was, and you can find this article online, he was stunned, right? Because the level of engineering, the efficiency that's now going into the production far surpasses anything that they're doing, not only in Detroit, but also at Tesla. And indeed, the engineers here told me that their plant, that they had gone and they had studied the gigafactory, the Tesla gigafactory in Shanghai, and that they had come up with something that surpasses it. Now, one of the curious things about China is that it's a very old country, as was noted from the beginning, but look at how many neighbors it has on its borders. There's no other country in the world that has that many neighbors on its near borders or within short range of cheap missiles. We could get into a long discussion why that's the case, why that's a historical feature, but that's for a different day. Let's simply note that it presents a unique security challenge. To the north, you have Russia. You may recall that China fought a war with Russia in the late 1960s. To the south, you have Vietnam. You may recall that China fought a war with Vietnam in the late 1970s. You may recall that in the early 1950s, China fought a war in Korea. It's not always been a safe neighborhood. Of course, they fought a civil war that the communists won in 1949, but the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, and Taiwan remains a source of contention to this day. There are other issues, but let's start talking about what might be the #1 strategic threat to China outside of, whatever Donald Trump cooks up in the next few months. Does anyone have an idea? Where is the greatest military threat on this planet located? India. Yes, sir. India? India does have some interesting characteristics. I think the jury is out about whether or not it will be able to replicate the sort of growth rates that we've seen with China. We know that the Modi government has struggled to discipline farmers in order to bring the country into RCEP. My sense is that it will be much harder for that government to achieve those same sorts of outcomes. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people who think that India is a future strategic threat. At the same time, India recently resolved some of its border issues with China ahead of BRICS. And if you look at the trade rates and the investment rate over the past year between China and India, you see a massive amount of money and machinery moving into India right now, and it's primarily coming from China. So that relationship is a little more nuanced than I think is sometimes portrayed in the Western press. Yeah, you have it. Yeah. Well, India would have to agree to it, right? We also saw that Brazil refused to agree to Venezuela joining, right? So it would have to be something that would be worked out initially by Pakistan and India, because India would hold a veto, right? I would suggest that the relationship with Pakistan is extremely complicated. Yeah. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right that the relationship between China and Russia is far more complicated, again, than it's usually portrayed in Western media. And we'll talk about that as much as we can, given the time. But in fact, Russia is helping China mitigate the threat that I have in mind. I'll take one more guess before, and I hope you guess right, but I also don't want to frustrate you. Any other guess? It's under the ice in the Arctic. Okay, what's under the ice? Oil? Even if there was oil under the ice, it wouldn't be worth going after. What's under the ice? No, I'm talking about the Arctic in the north. The Antarctic is actually very important strategically because China has concluded that the United States will unilaterally withdraw from the treaty not to mine and develop Antarctica, and China has been trying to position because of all the mineral wealth down there, which will certainly have an impact on strategic balances. So this is why China has been looking for friends in the southern hemisphere to be able to compete for that if it comes to it. But no, in the north, under the Arctic, under the ice, what we have are US nuclear missile submarines. That's half the distance, right? In other words, yes, you have all these silos in Missouri and other parts of the United States, but your first wave comes from your boats under the ice, right? Why are they under the ice? Because they can tether to the ice underneath. They don't have to run their engines. It's hard to hold position out in the Pacific because there's strong currents. And the ice helps obscure any sort of signature that might be picked up by satellites, right? Now, there's only one way that you can mitigate this threat. You have to get your hunter subs up under the ice and map where they are. And in the event of a conflict, try to kill as many as you can before they launch, right? Now, China can't do this. It can't mitigate this threat. It can't. Only one country can do that, and that's Russia, all right? China can't do it because the United States has put together a submarine line just off of China's coast that has a sonar net, and any time a Chinese sub leaves port, it's picked up and tracked by the American side. And if it starts getting close to one of the missile boats under the ice, they signal to the missile boat and they move it, right? So this is why you see the partnership between China and Russia cooperating in naval exercises in the Pacific, right? Okay. What else do we have here? China and Russia. So if you go back to the 1980s, this is before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'll tell you something just because it's my favorite little point and it's just going to titillate you. In 1956, Mao Zedong predicts that the Soviet Union will collapse. And he gives us a reason for its collapse. He lays out two reasons, and he says, this is why the Soviet Union will stagnate, and this is why it will collapse. Now, is Mao completely correct? He's correct in part. But the key point here is that Chinese strategic thinkers for a long time believed that the Soviet Union would collapse. This is one of the reasons why China chose to draw close to the United States starting in the late 1960s when they started making those overtures in 68 or 69. And then this was facilitated by Kissinger and Nixon in the early 1970s once the US understood that China was sincere. In other words, and just to go back to it, in the future, you're going to have to face the United States by yourself. And in the old art of war paradigm, which was influential in Mao's thinking, you get as close to your enemy as possible. That way, if he tries to hit you, he risks hitting himself, right? So, in any event, what was China most worried about in the early 1980s? And I know that none of you were alive except some of you who look as old as me. You don't remember the US Marines that got bombed out of their position in Lebanon, but this was a concern that the United States was going to penetrate Central Asia through Syria, that the Soviet Union would collapse, that the Soviet base, which was a base of denial for Central Asia, would collapse, and then the Americans would be able to penetrate Central Asia and thereby imperil China's third and fourth defensive lines, which they build further and further from the coast, and certainly their space industry and their oil industry is in Xinjiang. Well, you know that we're still fighting the Cold War today, in so much as the Crimea is also an old Soviet base. The Syria situation is an old Soviet base, and these have always been strategic objectives of NATO and the West. And this is why we continue to have conflict in part in Ukraine and Syria today. But neither one of them have fallen. Instead, the United States managed to penetrate Central Asia after 9/11, coming through Pakistan, which was quite horrifying to China because China likes to euphemistically say that China and Pakistan are as close as teeth and lips, right? So when the US came through Pakistan, entered Afghanistan, they didn't just enter Afghanistan, they also built air bases in other countries and former Soviet republics. Now, the cover for this was to prosecute the war on terror, to facilitate the military affairs in Afghanistan, but China certainly read it as an encirclement. And at the height of that, sometime around 2007, 8, 9, the estimates that I was hearing in Washington and Beijing is that the US had positioned themselves so that they could hit any target in China with conventional weapons inside of 15 minutes. That is a major threat, right? So this is why China then really begins to accelerate the development of some new weapon systems, and those will have certainly an impact on their strategic position. But they also begin to accelerate the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Will work closely with Russia, above all, in order to create more security options and economic incentives for Central Asian countries to push these American bases out and to try to ensure that they don't come back, right? Now, Russia wasn't able to provide those economic incentives, and certainly those countries had some fear of Russia, given their history of the Soviet Union. But China was able to say, well, we can keep Russia balanced, and we can provide the economic incentives, but China can only go into Central Asia if Russia is going to be a partner, because otherwise Russia would be able to frustrate those efforts. And so this is where we really begin to see the acceleration of a China-Russia strategic partnership, right? So Russia wants the US out of Central Asia, China wants them out, and a lot of the Central Asian nations wanted them out as well, all right? So that's why we begin to see cooperation, and then part of the incentivization will be building the Belt Road in order to provide the development and security that will support the overall mission. At the same time, the so-called war on terror was also about the United States putting a major military footprint in the Middle East, which would mean that in the event of a war with China, the United States would be able to control the flow of oil, right? So this is what pushed China to start looking for oil from less desirable sources in Africa, which the United States then blamed China for dealing with unsavory dictatorships. But it also accelerated China's engagement with Russia for energy and the building of pipelines. Now, China has tried to resist. Putin has pushed China to build yet another pipeline, and China has said no. China is instead sourcing more oil from Central Asia and the Middle East. This is why we see strong relations there. But at the same time, clearly, China has a vision where it will consume less oil over time through the increased adoption of renewable energy. Now, in the case of India, several of you brought up India. When the conflict in Ukraine was really going poorly, Putin promised to help mediate between China and India. And honestly, if you understand the geopolitics well enough, you understand that if India abandons concepts like the Indo-Pacific, then US containment has essentially failed, right? India is a rising economy, it is a major economy, and if Russia, India, and China are all more or less on the same page, I don't see how the West could hope, above all the US, could hope to contain them. In fact, I think the US containment strategy has already failed, but that remains to be seen. Nevertheless, once it became clear that Putin was winning the conflict in Ukraine, and by winning, I mean that both Russia and the United States have achieved their strategic objectives there. I don't think Europe or the Ukrainians are happy with those outcomes, but nevertheless, once it became clear that Putin wasn't going to lose, but at least achieve his baseline objectives, and once it was clear that Biden was not going to give up, and that the Ukrainian people were unable to come up with a consensus for negotiation, because there are about 8 different groups in Ukraine who can't decide which way they want to go, and most of them don't trust Zelensky or the military. Putin said, okay, I'll bleed them. I'll bleed them for the next couple of years if they're not going to stop, and that's going to serve my interest in the end. Now, according to some reports, this is why the former foreign minister of China fell. He was undercut by Russia. It was the former foreign minister of China who was pushing the peace plan because the conflict in Ukraine has been so devastating to China. There are some people who think that China has benefited from the war in Ukraine, but in fact, it has been a powerful source of poison for China-EU relations. And furthermore, it has created other problems that have been difficult to resolve. So China was pushing very strong to try to resolve this conflict, and then President Putin allegedly passed a dossier of compromat on the foreign minister, and this is what brought him down and was a source of embarrassment to the Chinese president because the Chinese president had chosen that foreign minister as a young man over other people because he was a favorite, right? But once it was exposed, he had to be dropped, and this was a way of pushing China back. And there we are. So maybe things will change in the next few months with Trump, but I'm not sure, again, that it's the change that most people wanted. And then, of course, the other thing that we've had is, you know, we see all these reports that China has been providing lethal assistance to Russia, although it hasn't been substantiated. But at the same time, the Pentagon released a report, a fear-mongering report, saying that China provides the critical components of 40% of the components for U.S. weapons, and that there needs to be some law that ensures that the U.S. military is not sourcing parts from China because this makes them vulnerable to China, so forth and so on. So one could turn this around and say that, in fact, China is providing lethal assistance to the United States, and then, of course, a lot of that lethal assistance is coming through your local port here and finding its way up to Ukraine. The other thing, of course, that we've seen is that the trade in Central Asia has skyrocketed over the past year from European firms dodging the sanctions imposed on them from trading directly with Russia. Now, where is that trade going? Is it all the Central Asians who are suddenly rich and buying European goods? No, it's all going to Russia, right? So there are a lot of games being played, but Central Asia is happy with them. Now, here you can see, this was several years ago before we started having the SEO work its magic. You can see where the US had penetrated up into Central Asia this way. This is more of a contemporary concept of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific Quad, that I think is going to fall apart, certainly under Trump. Which is supported by AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US deal that's selling nuclear submarines to Australia. Yeah.
Directly north of A, let's say, between Sakhalin and Alaska, more or less, about the interesting area with the submarines. Am I correct?
I don't think we know where they are under the ice, but just that they're under the Arctic ice, and they may be moving around. But actually, the ice would be north of you know, up some of the upper parts of Canada, and just reaching part of the northern part of Russia. So that far north, that's where the
Not north of, say, Iceland.
Yes, north of Iceland. Yes.
Yes, north of Iceland.
Yes.
And the missiles are so long range.
Yes.
China.
Well, if you get under the ice just north of Russia, they're not that far away. Yeah. So, I mean, Beijing would be in range, Shenyang, Jilin, so forth and so on. Now, what's interesting is I was talking about the problem with India. Just ahead of the recent BRICS meeting, China and India managed to resolve one of their issues on the border. Now, I work a lot with Indian diplomats. I help mediate between them and the Chinese government because sometimes the diplomats can't speak as candidly and they need to like communicate in different ways. And one of the things that we've really been talking about is how we can resolve this issue between the two countries because it's very dangerous for both sides. There was a terrible flare-up a few years ago, or a couple of years ago. The best we can tell is that the Indians crossed the border. This seems to have been admitted by Modi, but they didn't anticipate being beaten to death once they did. So there's, and we don't know how many died on the Chinese side. That was classified. But the Indians certainly made a big deal out of the number of people that they lost. Was that a rogue nationalist military element that was trying to game Modi into a conflict? We don't really know the source or why it happened. But it has been something that has been a major stumbling block in terms of their ability to talk. What does India really want from China? I mean, honestly, it can be summarized in two main points. They want access to China's pharmaceutical market, and they want China to support India for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, right? These are really easy for China to give, by the way, right? And it was, so are we moving in that direction? That's what we have been discussing and encouraging because I think it's good to have India, one of the major countries in the world, a nuclear armed power. I think it's good to have them on the Security Council. Of course, I don't think my colleagues in Lahore or Islamabad would agree with me, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that because, I would argue, China and India have been working together through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, despite the fact that Putin did not follow through on his commitment to mediate between China and India, because one could argue that who Putin fears the most is in fact China, and he wants to continue to counterbalance and play that role between those two countries, that India and China have started working out their differences through the fact that they've been working together on these other initiatives, and this explains in part the significant increase in trade and Chinese investment that we've seen in India over the past year. So I would suggest that the Quad is probably falling apart. India was always the country that was most exposed and had the most to lose. And of course, AUKUS is under significant attack in Australia itself. But of course, the US also put nuclear-capable bombers on the Australian northern coast and has returned nuclear submarine patrols to South Korea. And if you saw the news, what was it, a year and a half ago, one of the American nuclear attack subs crashed into a seamount just off the Chinese coast, narrowly averted a massive disaster. That captain was court-martialed, I think. But there are a lot of dangerous games taking place right now in that region. That was in the South China Sea. Now here, this is, you can see these are American military where they exist today. This is a mapping system. And you can see how the focus is China. We can go past this. Now, if you look at China's conflicts, all of its conflicts, all of them, all of its conflicts with other countries have to do with sovereignty. They all have to do with sovereignty. So the issue of Tibet, for some people that's an issue of two countries. For China, it's one country and it's an issue of sovereignty and security. Xinjiang, sovereignty. Hong Kong, sovereignty. The Diaoyu Islands, or with Japan, sovereignty. It's also a possible breakout point for Chinese subs to get to open water before they're picked up by US patrols. South China Sea, sovereignty, security, right? If you look at the map, and we'll look at what is now called the 10-dash line, it's trying to create positions, defensive positions, in this soft underbelly of Chinese security against the various positions that the US has built, right? Now China is asserting a historical claim to the South China Sea, and they make these claims with these historic maps where clearly at one point in time they did exert some power. But it's not about trying to seize resources or antagonize local neighbors. It's about trying to push back against the threats that have been pushed in on them as the US has increased its great power competition paradigm with China. Again, the Quad. Now, you all know what NATO is. It's next door. What you're probably also aware is that, do you remember the spy balloon incident in the US a couple of years ago, right? And it turns out it was a weather balloon. Turns out it was a weather balloon that got loose, that it wasn't a spy balloon. How do we know that? The Pentagon finally admitted that, right? They weren't collecting any information. They weren't transmitting information, contrary to the absolute certainty that the Biden administration, right, and the Biden administration let it drift over the U.S. and hover over Kansas or wherever it was before it finally was no longer actually a threat to the U.S. and then shot it down in a very dramatic way, right? And then started this fear-monger, oh, Chinese balloons are all over the world, blah, 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 right? It was a balloon that was designed to study climate change. Right? That's the bottom line. Now, shortly after that, this is what occasioned Biden canceling Blinken's planned visit. And then what you had was the US coming to Brussels to assert that China had effectively attacked the United States with that balloon, right? And that this should trigger NATO to expand its remit against China. Right? Now, this argument didn't go over very well in Brussels, but it was something that someone like Jens Stoltenberg found very attractive. He's always been very attracted to the US hard line. And this occasioned not expanding NATO in a formal sense to Asia, but opening a NATO office in Japan, and at the same time building parallel efforts like AUKUS, which are forerunners to a NATO expansion or a parallel organization that would work in tandem with NATO in the Pacific. Why isn't Japan already in AUKUS? Anybody know why? Their technological security is insufficient. They can't be trusted. Japan has to go through a thorough upgrading of its security in terms of its digital space before it can be admitted into that security framework. Nevertheless, in the past couple of years, of course, we've seen the significant expansion of NATO. Of course, Russia blames this continued expansion on one of the reasons why the war was started. Whether or not you buy that is a separate story. But clearly, under the Biden administration, there has been this idea that they would continue to expand NATO and then also try to link it with their efforts to build something similar in Asia. Does this mean that the battery's dying? Now this here is IMEC, and it's proposed as an alternative to the Belt Road Initiative. And it also cuts close to home. And some of these countries are, of course, partners of Belt Road. And by the way, China doesn't oppose IMEC. That's the funny thing. The United States fundamentally opposes Belt Road, and we saw a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Trade Representative threatened Brazil. Tsai said that if you join the Belt Road Initiative, there could be consequences, and because Brazil, the Brazilian economy depends on its close relationship not only with China but also the United States, and certainly given the U.S. Hegemonic position in terms of the global financial system. Brazil held back and didn't join the Belt Road. That may change in the next few months. For example, if Trump takes an aggressive stand against Brazil, then Brazil might reconsider its position, or hopefully Brazil's holding on to that in order to prevent the U.S. from taking a more aggressive stance with Trump. But in China's way of thinking, the more development, the better, because China is building this infrastructure in these areas, and this is designed to increase the flow of goods and services and businesses, which China believes makes these areas more valuable, which will accrue value to their investments in those areas as well. So the U.S. is building them, or at least proposing them, as an alternative to the Belt Road. And China's like, yeah, if you want to invest in these areas where we're investing, we think that's marvelous. Go right ahead. Now this is going to be too, I think, esoteric or to see. Now the Belt Road, when President Xi first proposed the Belt Road Initiative 10 years ago, it was not a popular thing in China. In fact, many people in the party were opposed to it. A lot of people in China, if not xenophobic, some of them are, they are nationalists. They don't want to really engage aggressively with others. Why should we invest in others' well-being? Why don't we keep that money at home? And the fact of the matter is, Beijing went ahead and did it, and if they hadn't done it, China would really be in a mess of trouble now. So that was some good strategic insight and commitment. And I can't remember the percentage right now, but there is a UN figure as well as some other independent studies that say that the Belt Road is now one of the major drivers of global economic growth or global GDP, especially in the ASEAN region and a few other parts of the global south. What's interesting is that China has not spent a terrible amount of money on it over the past 10 years, and certainly things took a step back during the pandemic, but they are moving forward again. This is the picture of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, one of the interesting things with the Belt Road is CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's probably the most advanced, although maybe we could say not the most successful. The more successful, more productive BRI projects are in the ASEAN countries. But in Pakistan, probably the biggest project is the CPEC, which is building this corridor down to the Gwadar seaport, where China also has a position. And it was a source of some contention with India because it was getting very close and even overlapping a little bit of the contested territory between Pakistan and India. And it came across the part, so there's a part that India claims that was under Pakistani control that Pakistan gave to China. And then China built across that, and so India says, well, you built across our space. So this is one way of looking at it, but another way of looking at it is that it will also, if the relationship with, you see where Lahore is, it will also be an on-ramp for India for the Belt Road, right? Now, why is the Belt Road so significant? It's not only because it can help bring development to Central Asia, which would improve the security situation in Central Asia, but also because China presently ships most of its stuff over the ocean, and this is vulnerable to US blockades, right? But it's also vulnerable to extreme weather. Or if you saw what's happening with Israel and the Houthi and the impact on shipping in the Red Sea, right? In other words, even a very small conflict can have a disruption of 50% of global shipping, right? So if you have as a backup this ability to move things overland through countries that are friendly with you, you have access to the European market. And it's not just that China has access to the European market, but Europe also has access to to Central Asia and China. So it's a two-way street. The problem, though, is that Pakistan has, and listen, I hope I'm not offending anyone who is close to Pakistan, but Pakistan has long played this double game of when they've frustrated China to a certain point, then they turn towards the United States. When they've frustrated the United States to a certain point, they turn back to China. And they use this to accommodate what is fundamentally a corrupt system that doesn't want to change the status quo. So it keeps playing these two sides off of each other and keeping Pakistan in a position of tremendous backwardness, but also increasing vulnerability as the relationship between India and China has improved, but also the relationship between India and the United States, right? So Pakistan is at risk for being left out in the cold, but at the same time, they have this massive CPEC project, the biggest of the BRI projects. However, the Pakistani military, either intentionally or due to a lack of capacity, has not been able to secure it. So it remains perpetually vulnerable to terrorist or some other attack. But we also know that there are elements in the Pakistani secret service, the ISI, but also in the Pakistani military, who are anti-China, and they may be gaming CPEC. And this has put tremendous pressure on China to find some sort of security arrangement to ensure that those investments. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to go through the rest of the slides real quick, and then we will just open it up to questions. The string of pearls. The do you know the conflict between the ADB and the AIIB, the BRICS? BRICS is a counterbalance to the G7. It also is forming a voting bloc within the G20. The RCEP, this is what was pushed forward when Trump abandoned the TPP. It's become a major driver of economic growth. Australia, of course, is struggling with its participation in AUKUS, but nevertheless, let's go. So this is the 10-dash line, and here the purpose is to push back against these encroaching American installations and to build a firmer defensive position. Same. This is on the island of Hainan, the southernmost part of China. It's an independent province. Next year, the entire island will be a free trade zone or free trade port, which means that you can arrive there without a visa, you can stay 2 weeks, you can do investment, you can move money in and out. They will have a secure financial system that's linked directly by cable to Hong Kong. It's also Hainan that's been given jurisdiction, maritime jurisdiction, economic jurisdiction over the South China Sea. And it's also in Hainan where China has built a spaceport. And this would be its closest spaceport to the equator. And it's scheduled for commercial launches. I haven't been able to get access to it. When I do, I'll write about it, but we'll skip this. Here we can see in the past year, couple of years, China meeting with the Taliban, China meeting with the Central Asian nation leaders, Middle Eastern leaders, African. This is not. Beijing Declaration, and then the African leaders. So, final slide, and then we'll go to questions. So what are some of the key concepts? So one of the things that China says today is that China has gone through 3 historical periods over the course of what China calls New China, which starts with the founding of the PRC in 1949. The first 30 years under Mao Zedong's leadership is described as when China achieved sovereignty and basic security and laid the foundation for what came. The second 30 years, largely under Deng or his 2 hand-picked successors, was when China began to achieve the necessary economic wealth to make the next big step forward, including raising 800 million people out of poverty, establishing a middle-income population of 400 million, and so on. And then in what we call the new era, which starts with Xi Jinping, this is when China consolidates its position as a major power, as a major country. And then it needs to begin to develop what President Xi calls a major country diplomacy. And so this is where we see China aggressively promoting things like the SCO, BRICS, BRI, GDI, GSI, GCI, so forth and so on. Again, I would describe this as a new internationalism, but quite different from the old internationalism of the Soviet Union. It again is trying to support the United Nations and the United Nations vision. I think the key to remember about China is that China does not have a universal vision. They are susceptible to a type of cultural exceptionalism. They do think that they have a different way of thinking, and they think that they don't want to rule you or take responsibility for your problems, that that's up to you. In fact, they are rather obsessed with the fact that they don't rule themselves as well as they should. And they're always trying to figure out a way to improve their own rule, and it would horrify them to think about how to solve your problems. So in other words, they don't think that they have a system that is exportable or transportable or portable in some sense. And in fact, it's not. The closest thing that I could describe the Chinese political system to, the closest analogy would be something like this. It's going to be misleading to say this, but the Hindu caste system. So, you know, you see Buddhism that can spread rather easily to different countries and different civilizations, but Hinduism really only spreads where Indian people go, right? Because very rarely do you see another civilization go, yeah, that caste thing is something that looks really good to us, and let's put that in place. The way the Chinese system works, the way the party works from the grassroots, from the neighborhood, from the village, all the way up to the top, it's not something that can be recreated in any culture. And China knows this better than anyone else, and they also know that they're not satisfied with their own efforts. So, commitment to multilateralism, because that's the only way they can move forward. Sorry if I misspelled some words. I was on the airplane and I couldn't get the spell check to work. It said everything was spelled right, but I knew it was lying. Opposed to unilateralism, sanctions, hegemony, resolution through, excuse me, they support resolving through diplomacy. They oppose resolution through conflict. The third plenum, the CPC meeting this year, one of the things that they gave us was an inversion. So in the past, they said that we should reform, that China should reform in order to open up. But now the paradigm is we've now reached a sufficient level of development and confidence, and we know that our system works. And what we need to do is open up more in order to push ourselves to reform. And so this is, if you look at the case studies that are being drawn on how China has developed EVs or AI, you will see where this is the new model, where it's open competition and the best firms survive. So this is where we see China now in this new competitive mode, and partly this explains why we see some of the protectionism from other countries. We also see other countries, including those in Europe, who are thinking about the China game, which is, okay, we'll close our market, and we'll induce you to invest in our market and build your EVs here. And this is something that I think China expected Europe to do instead of tariffs, because that would make more sense for everyone. And of course, some countries want to do that, but it's not something that's taken place. Again, apologies for the bad spell words. Shared future for humanity, this is the other idea that President Xi has promoted, and I'll yield now to Q&A.
Professor Mahoney, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I think everyone learned a lot of things about China that we could never anticipate or predict that would happen. However, although I don't want to abuse the time for questioning, I think that in this case, the most, let's say, important thing that we can detect regarding China is your initial PowerPoint presentation. So I would like to ask where have you seen a similar photo before? Well, the only navy that has ever produced a similar photo displaying its might, its power, is the United States. And China is replicating exactly the same model, showing that it wants to be considered at least equal to the United States in military terms, and is certainly advancing to become #1 economic power in the world. Thank you very much. And I will leave the floor to questions. We have the microphone, so whoever wishes to ask a question, please tell me in order to get you the microphone.
Before he goes there, I'm going to ask you, which country has more aircraft carriers, India or China? Which country has more aircraft carriers, India or China? India. Okay. China is building a limited blue water navy, primarily to support its security in the South China Sea. All right? It knows that it can't compete with the US Navy globally. It also knows that the US Navy has another mission, which is to provide relief in times of great crisis. And China has increasingly become a player. We saw this with the volcano eruption down the South Pacific. How do you logistically get down and start relieving those efforts? They tend to be carrier groups that go down. So in other words, I wouldn't overplay the image. I was very aware that when I put this as a first image, it would be provocative, but this is in the South China Sea. It's not in the Mediterranean. It's not in the Middle East. It's not in the Persian Gulf. This is in China's near waters.
Okay, who would like to ask a question? Anyone?
I'm sorry to get your place. I was thinking while you were talking about the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative and so on into that, in my opinion, there is also a question of the urgence for China to create an inner market, not to be too dependent on Western markets for its own growth and economy. So in my feeling is that there is always a very complex thinking when we come to read China. It's not only one vision. They create multiple layers in one action. So they fight poverty, create inner markets. So the coastal area is not the only area that can produce, because they free energies from central China, able to export through other ways that is not only maritime. Do you agree with that?
I would say one of the things that China has consistently failed to achieve, despite significant efforts, is to stimulate more domestic consumption, to decrease the high rates of savings, to make it less dependent on export-led growth. There have been tremendous policy debates over how to do this, what sort of stimulus, what sort of coupons or other things should you do in order to advance this. President Xi's position on it, or at least that of his major advisors, is that we need to enact structural reforms of the Chinese economy before we start encouraging people to buy things from an economy that isn't yet really where it should be. In other words, that's just accumulating debt and not really sustainable growth. There's a strong argument there, but then at the same time, after it was clear that Trump was elected, China launched a massive stimulus ahead of an expected new trade war. So, and a lot of that's going to stimulate domestic consumption.
Okay. Leonidas would like to ask a question.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. First, I would like to express my complete ignorance on China and Chinese politics. So that's why I have many questions, but I would like to ask them all. Anyway, question number one, about the CO2 emissions. Is there a strategic plan with concrete goals for the whole country? Second and third, they are related. Decision making, is it based on a kind of pluralism, or everything is discussed and decided inside the Communist Party? And the situation with individual rights. Thank you very much.
Okay. So let's start with how the political system functions. So one of the most misunderstood things about the Chinese political system is that it is not a monolith. Roughly 99 million members of the Communist Party. They come from all over the country, different economic backgrounds, different economic interests, and quite a lot of them are in significant competition with each other over resources, policy favors, investment, so forth and so on. So how can you balance between all of those, all of that tremendous diversity? You can't do it from simply exercising an iron fist from Beijing. Now, I could also tell you that the other biggest failure in China in terms of policy reforms has been the attempt to reform the national education system in terms of, I don't know if you know what the Gaokao is, the college entrance exam, and how it places this entire what's the right word? There's like this whole system that goes all the way down and touches even children in kindergarten in terms of how it affects people. It's not paternalistic. It's just this really incredibly reductive industrial model of education that creates this very unhealthy competition at the local level between schools that in turn has a deleterious effect on children. So what we see is that actually China's international scores have begun to decline, and so Beijing has been trying to figure out a way to pull this system back, but they haven't been able to do it because local people are constantly trying to use the system to advance their own well-being. So you know, they do have some tremendous failures sometimes in areas that they most care about. And so I sometimes joke that the strongest or the most powerful people in China is not the leadership in Beijing, but the teachers in the primary school above all. But anyway, the thing is, China has a system, and I know that this creates some chuckles in some corners, that they call whole process people's democracy. And the way this works is that there are what they call consultative conferences at the local level, but also the national level, that include people from leading industries, cultural affairs, universities, and they serve in an advisory role, and they meet. They have a big congress each year, but then they also meet at the local level, and they make proposals based on their connections with society about what needs to be addressed or improved, so forth and so on. They also listen to the local government and national government work reports. There you have the congresses that include all members, representations of the mass organizations, there's 8 minor parties, and then of course the Communist Party. The Communist Party does dominate these things, and it's a condition of the constitutions of the minor parties that they have to recognize the leadership position of the CPC. But the thing that I think is we have to come back to is that according to the most recent Pew Research polls, 85% of the Chinese people trust the decision-making of their government. Now, you would be hard-pressed to find a Western society that shows that level of approval. The other thing is, I was in Shanghai during the lockdown. I was there for COVID. The overwhelming majority of the Chinese people were very satisfied with the government's response to COVID. And as I don't think this was revealed in my intro, but in the 1990s, I was an epidemiologist and a public health officer with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. And what I can tell you is that, I can tell you 2 things. First, that what China achieved in containing COVID was unparalleled. There's no other major country that achieved the same result, and we didn't think it was possible. But I can also tell you, just as an aside, where did COVID come from? What caused COVID? Do you know? I'll tell you, I know you're not going to believe me, but I'll tell you anyway. Climate change. We had models at the CDC, at the World Health Organization, that predicted in 2020 that we would have a major coronavirus outbreak. Why? Because we had already had 3 of them. SARS-1, SARS-2, MERS, and we were calling it disease X. And we had already observed that these outbreaks were correlated with climate change, that coronaviruses are especially vulnerable to mutation under small changes in the environment. This is why Moderna was so far ahead in developing the vaccine, because they were already developing a vaccine. This is why we had all these laboratories all over the world doing research on coronaviruses, because it was coming, and we knew that it was coming. The strange thing about COVID is that our models for disease X predicted something that was much worse than what we got, right? But the key point is that we will continue to have black swan events like COVID. But nevertheless, the point is, China was only able to achieve this successful response to the outbreak, which included a lot of restrictions on society, because that's what society demanded from its government. Right? Now, were there some people unhappy with it? Yes. Okay. Were they vocal? Yes. Did that get played up a lot in the Western media? Yes. But most people supported it, right? Supported it. You can only do that when you have government, technology, people working together. You can only do that when you have local neighborhood committees effectively organizing and putting forward the policy. Now, I was in Rome yesterday, the day before yesterday, at the UN think tank SIOI, and we were talking about, you know, the Chinese people value security and certain types of other cultural values over, say, privacy or other things. What I can tell you is that personally, I've experienced a lot more freedom in China than I do in the United States. I was a professor in the US for 10 years, but I was also a political activist. I got bought out and blacklisted, and then I moved to China. Now, maybe it's just that my own political worldview is more suitable to China, and therefore I'm able to move along. But I'll tell you another secret that I shouldn't tell you. I've sued the Chinese government 4 times. Yeah. Including the police in Shanghai Superior Court. Right? Who do you think won? I did. I can show you proof. I can show you proof of the victory. My little permanent resident card, okay? Because I sued them 6 years ago, and the people that I sued are precisely the people who give you this. And then they hated me and they didn't want to give it to me. So then I took care of it, okay? But I wouldn't be able to do that, I think. Or I don't know if you could do that, maybe you could. I have a friend, a Chinese friend who lives in Athens, and she's not able to move forward right now with immigration laws here. I don't know the particulars of her case. But I don't think you would imagine that you would be able to sue the Chinese government or the police and live to tell the story, let alone be victorious in the outcome. And then at the same time remain one of the top professors and key opinion leaders trusted by the central government to advise them on matters like, I mean, why would you expect the police to mess with me anyway when I already have that position, right? So I think China is really quite a bit different than what you perceive. It's just that the trade-offs that we make there are different than what you make here. For example, if you're a woman and you want to walk anywhere in Shanghai or Beijing any time of the day without being at risk, you can do so, right? You can do so. There's not going to be any trouble. At the same time, you're constantly under surveillance, right? Now, the fact of the matter is, you're constantly under surveillance here anyway. The main reason is because you carry the listening device in your own pocket, okay? But the fact of the matter is, Chinese people want security. They're very conservative in this way. Of course, they have a different history, but nevertheless. Now, you also asked the question. Human rights. So I was also at this thing in Rome, and you know, it's one of these things like when you go to the church and you have to cross yourself. It's like anytime someone is talking about China, they have to raise the issue of human rights. And I said, okay, well, what about the AI that's being used to target children in Gaza, and the guns that are being used are coming from Italy? I mean, when we talk about human rights, or we talk about the problem of migrants or minorities in Europe, we can always turn this around. We can also look at, well, what was the history of the United States? How did the United States and a lot of the G7 countries get their start? Colonialism, imperialism, genocide, slavery, right? Continued World War, domination. So this is a history, but it's also a history that continues. Now, in China's case, they would say, you know, the Chinese people would say, we raised more than 800 million people out of poverty. That's a human right. Okay? We've rebuilt the health system. That's a human right. We've made our countries secure from foreign influence and domination. That's a human right? It has required that we discipline certain parts of the country in order to ensure those larger rights. For example, it's been imperative that we have to discipline Tibet, okay? But the Dalai Lama, and let me say a few words about the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama says the most impressive, important person he ever met in life was Mao Zedong. He also said the biggest mistake he ever made in life was getting in bed with the CIA in 1959 to stage the uprising against China at China's most vulnerable moment during the Great Leap Forward. Okay? So this is, and remember the importance of Tibet for Chinese security. It's non-negotiable. So we do have these examples, but what happened in Xinjiang, even the US State Department legal team said it wasn't a genocide. They couched it and said it was a cultural genocide, and then that was the word we used in Western media for a few weeks, and then they went back to the word genocide, right? And if you go to X or Twitter, you'll see that the term genocide in Xinjiang is trending more than the term genocide in Gaza, right? Where we actually have a real genocide. Right? So it's sometimes, I think there's this narrative or this perception that gets built up and perpetuated in Western discourses that are in some fundamental way disconnected from reality. And I don't ask you to trust me. I'm not here as a propagandist. I am someone who has chosen to raise my children there and build my life there, and maybe I didn't have much of a choice. But I would suggest that you go to China yourself. You want to go to China, and here I'm kind of kidding, but I'm also serious. I direct a master's and PhD program. You want to go to do a master's in Shanghai for 2 years? You want us to pay for it? You want free tuition, free housing, a monthly stipend, and health insurance? Let me know. We have a master's and PhD program in politics and international relations. Come, we'll teach you Chinese. You can make up your own damn mind, and you can then take your Chinese and go to work for NATO or whoever you want to work for, right? It's your right to do that. We've had some people do that. We've had some people come and go the other way, but nevertheless, that would be up to you. There was another question. CO2. You know, my Achilles heel is remembering numbers. I know that China has a 2030 and a 2050 goal. I know they're very serious about it. As I mentioned before, they were moving very aggressively with this goal last year, but then we ran into some imbalances. I will tell you that the thing that you should, if you really want to pay attention to the next big thing, it's the blue economy. This is where China is clearly in the lead. This is where you're going to see energy transfers and a whole lot of other things. I was at a major meeting in Shenzhen a week and a half ago. The only Europeans I saw there were from France, and Scandinavia. There may have been others. I didn't meet everyone there. It was a few thousand people there. But this is we were talking, I think, in the beginning about, there's some talk here about building the wind turbines in the sea here, but some people are opposed. They don't want to look at clean energy when they look at the ocean. But there's a system that goes underneath these turbines that then connects to other apparatuses of the blue economy. And this is where China's in the lead. This is where China's in the lead in developing AI and other applications that are useful for this. This is the next big thing. Hopefully it will actually be blue and not brown. But China's planning it to be part of the Belt Road, but also, you know, the part that they're building through the sea, and being completely integrated with the green economy. And again, this is trying to respond to the problems, the real problems that are driving a lot of their strategic thinking in China related to climate change. So they are absolutely committed to a green future because they don't have a choice. Whether or not they're able to hit certain targets, or whether or not they are contributing to brown development elsewhere in terms of their relations with developing countries is another issue. But I think one of the things that you should remember is which country in the world is the largest trading partner of every other country in the world? China. Which country has the leading manufacturing system in the world? China. Which country produces the most products? China, okay? So it's not just that China is producing and consuming all of that energy for itself. It's producing most of the products that you're buying for yourself, and that's what's producing a lot of that pollution in China, right? So China is building things for the rest of the world and creating pollution, but it's unfair to say that all of that is, you know, on China. And then, of course, you have the other issue of social justice and the right of the global south to develop. And there's this perception that the global north is trying to hamstring the global south by imposing green rules in order to perpetuate the global north privileges. That's another discussion. But were there other questions? Yes, sir.
I want to ask a question about the inner politics of China, if that's okay for you. The inner politics. I heard that, I'm sure that you heard about the Uyghurs living in China, the Muslim minority. I've heard that they are going through genocide, racism, they are living in bad conditions. What's the reason? What is the Chinese government is trying to do? Why are they being racist to them? Why are they living in bad conditions? They can't even pray, they can't even have food to eat. What's the reason?
Well, most of what you just said is factually untrue. Now, I know I've seen the exposés on the BBC. I used to do shows on the BBC, and I remember I did one where they, had the guy in the street who was interviewing a Chinese woman. This was after they had lifted the term restrictions on President Xi, and he asked her, what do you think about lifting the conditions? And he asked in Chinese, and she answered in Chinese, I don't think it's a big deal. And then he turns around and tells the audience in English, she's very concerned. But he didn't realize that she spoke English, and she yelled at him, and that's not what I said. And then they cut to me and then tried to ask me a bullshit question that they'd said that I'll ask you a different question. I said, hold on a minute. So there's a lot of misinformation. If you were listening earlier, I said that the US State Department legal team had actually investigated what was happening in Xinjiang and had concluded that there was no genocide. So what they decided to call it instead was cultural genocide, right? In other words, placing restrictions on people in terms of their ability to perpetuate their religious faith. Now, was there a significant policing action in Xinjiang? There was. Has that largely been resolved? It has. Is it something that we should be happy about? We should not. Was it worse than what the Americans did in Afghanistan? No. Iraq? No. Syria now? No. So what's the standard by which is it worse than what Israel's doing in Gaza? No. So when we say genocide, and the State Department says it wasn't actually genocide, and then we actually do have real genocides, I don't understand the conversation, and I'm not being disrespectful to you. There are a lot of people who have this question. Now, I can tell you that there were several problems that came to a head in Xinjiang that created the problem because if you go back before 2000, the Uyghurs are largely a satisfied and happy minority in China. There were Turkish elements that were trying to agitate because there is, and I don't think I have to convince any of you here that Turkey has, ambitions. I don't agree with the assessment that they have a lot of ambitions towards Greece, but they certainly have a lot of ambitions towards Central Asia. And the Uyghurs are a Turkic people. We do know that a lot of the people there is at least a strong argument and allegation that a large number of the people that came out of Xinjiang and into Daesh were facilitated perhaps by Turkey. I haven't seen convincing evidence, but that's something that's been alleged by various groups that are certainly hostile to Turkey. We also know that there's a separatist group that was based in the U.S. that was agitating there. We know that when the U.S. penetrated Central Asia, this created pressures there. But in addition to all of this, there was a problem in 2000 where China, according to the plan, began to take wealth from the coastal regions and invest it in the interior. And at that time, China was in one of its more corrupt periods. And initially, the Uyghurs were very excited about this. Oh, development's coming to us, so forth and so on. Unfortunately, that development came initially through corrupt officials and corrupt state-owned enterprises who were taking land and using it for development purposes, but not perhaps adequately compensating local people. They were not hiring local people. They were bringing workers from the east. Whenever these big state-owned enterprises go, a whole, it's like remember the old wars in Europe? There'd be like a whole train of people providing food and services. So the same thing happens. It's restaurants, it's drinking, it's alcohol, prostitution, all these things follow wherever these big companies go. And local people felt like they weren't getting their fair shake, and this created some concerns. At the same time, there was an issue related to women, where increasingly women, as these problems started happening, people started falling back into a religious identity as a mode of resistance. But the women, the Uyghur women didn't like this because that consigns them to an outcome that is going to be less favorable than the one for men. And so this started a trend where Uyghur women were trying to escape from that. And for better or worse, the Chinese government promoted inter-ethnic marriage. So now if you're a Uyghur woman and you don't want to marry into that system, you can marry someone from another group, and then this conveyed certain benefits, right? So was it well managed? Could it have been managed better? Absolutely. Was it managed as poorly as 20 years of massively corrupt occupation in Afghanistan that was so vicious that the Afghan people welcomed the Taliban back to power? I don't think that was the case. So I think we need to have a realistic perspective here. It's not something that we should be proud of, but it wasn't something that is as terrible as it's been presented in global media. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah. No, I told you, I like hard questions.
Hello, thank you very much for the speech. So for the past decades, we see that China has a strong presence in African countries, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So African countries, you talk about Belt Road and China and Africa. Is there a specific issue?
Let me see my notes. Yes, they have created very strong relations with, and they like to give loans, and they invest in infrastructure, and there are very certain, very specific conditions for a country to get money from China, like they cannot recognize Taiwan as a country.
They can't recognize what?
They cannot recognize Taiwan as a country, and
Taiwan,
they
yeah.
usually vote in favor of China in the United Nations or something like that.
Okay. So Taiwan is the #1 red line for China. And I think it's currently 190 countries in the UN that recognize China as China, that recognize the mainland. I know that the EU, the European Commission voted recently to condemn China's interpretation of the UN resolution on Taiwan. I would suggest you go back and read that, and you will read that the resolution does not assert the one China policy, but if you look at two other things, the number of votes that were held in the lead up to that, you will notice that they were all rejecting the idea that there were two Chinas, or that there was one China or one Taiwan. And then finally, if you look at the document on final causes, you will note that the UN has decided on multiple occasions that there is one China and that Taiwan is a province of China. So looking at that one specific resolution, but outside of the context of the other things, is really grossly misleading and unfortunate. And you have to recall that most people in Taiwan believe that Taiwan is part of China. They just believe that they should have the right to rule China. So that's part of it. Or if they don't agree with that, they at least don't assert that they should be independent. The DPP did not win more than 50% of the last vote. Even though they took the presidency, the remaining vote was split between two parties. So yes, this is a red line. If you support Taiwan, China says we're not going to do business with you. And that's it, as far as I know. Now, there are other allegations. Janet Yellen, for example, I think she was in Zambia and a few other places. She's raised the specter of debt traps. But most of the research, almost all of the research that I've seen, and this includes coming from non-Chinese sources, independent foreign scholars and think tanks and study groups, that it's not creating debt traps. Where is most of the toxic debt? Who holds most of the toxic debt in Africa and other parts of the developing world? It's the private bondholders in London and New York who refuse to restructure. So this is one of the reasons why these countries have been so interested in these types of investments, because it does offer an opportunity. Now, China is insistent that it has to be a win-win. In other words, that it can't be a giveaway. And it's not just at the governmental level. We can also see this in companies. For example, Huawei, the Chinese tech company. They developed a base station for cellular service. And it's something that can be mounted on a tree and then powered by solar. So it's low energy, real low cost. And these have been sold now extensively in developing countries in Africa, islands throughout Indonesia and elsewhere. And what it's doing is it's bringing the digital age to these regions that would be unable to have that type of access. Now, Huawei designed this product, and they sell it and they make a profit, right? But at the same time, the United Nations has recognized them as playing a responsible corporate role in bringing a service and technology at a price point that these local communities are able to afford, which then allows them to participate in global affairs and the digital economy in important ways. So the rubric is that, yes, China needs to be able to see a return on its investment. And by the way, here's another little secret. What's the biggest risk to the Chinese government? What's the biggest risk to the Chinese political system? Another misconception, Chinese nationalist. So for example, whenever Pelosi or some US official goes to Taiwan and China, has a big response, the Chinese nationalists in China are the ones saying, you didn't respond enough, you should have attacked, you should have, and so there's this sort of constant tension. And some years ago, I was talking to some colleagues who work in the Ministry of Propaganda in Beijing, and they said that 70% of what they censor is Chinese nationalism. And they constantly have to sort of like pull this back and try to resist this sort of urge to go out and be aggressive against others, because it would be self-defeating, right? It would certainly undermine what China has in mind strategically, but also some of the values that they're promoting. So it has to be win-win. They can't just give away things. I told you that a lot of people didn't want the Belt Road anyway. So they have to be able to demonstrate that they're getting a return from it. And certainly they can't afford to build the rest of the world at their own expense. Nevertheless, the idea that they're debt traps or that they're compelling people to take bad deals is simply far-fetched.
No, my question regarded Taiwan as well, so it was answered.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for remaining here so late. I hope it was a very interesting presentation, and Professor Mahoney had the, let's say, patience to respond to every question that was posed. I would like to thank everyone for your presence here. I would also like to thank our technician who stayed here until 10 o'clock in order to assist us. Thank you very much. And well, in the near future, we're going to organize similar events like this. Thank you all.